getting ready for the incredible sound of classic rock? No? Good, because now it's time for Visiting the Village.
Hello and welcome to Visiting the Village. I'm Paul Kilduff-Taylor, and joining me as ever is the baseless Ian Hardingham.
Hello, I'm Ian Hardingham, and my faith in technology is completely baseless.
Let's get out of this dungeon.
It's the top story.
Eurogamer spoke to Shuei Yoshida about Microsoft's surprise crossplay announcement at GDC. According to the head of Sony Worldwide Studios, it may not be in Sony's best interest to allow crossplay between Xbox and PlayStation. Ian Hardingham, in your opinion, is that in Sony's best interests?
No, I don't think it's in Sony's best interests. I don't think it's particularly in Microsoft's best interests. Although I did like the point that you made to me on a previous version of this podcast that in fact Microsoft was just trolling Sony and they knew that Sony would never do it, and they just for once in this generation wanted to sound like the more permissive, open of the two warring factions in the console battle. So yes, I don't know. Rocket League, I think, has just come out on the Xbox One. I suppose it would be nice for these two console generations to play against each other, but I have to be honest, I find it difficult to get excited about this subject.
I mean, have you had the experience, though, of wanting to play a multiplayer game with someone who's on a different platform, like in the recent generation?
Oh, I guess that's true. I guess if you have a lot of friends and you play multiplayer online with a console and they're on different generations, and I guess that's understandable. I mean, that's something that you would definitely want. Although again, these Xbox Live and PlayStation Online offerings, they're very mature now. You have these great friends lists, you have all these great services, and it's probably just going to be a really bad experience, to be honest. You know, if it's something that could be made law that it had to be the same service for both consoles, that would be a better result, because it means that you wouldn't be stuck on one side of the big console divide. I'm just imagining that actually using this service would be bad as well.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that. I think there's definitely going to be some big technical challenges, sort of irrespective of, you know, whether it's the right thing to do. It definitely does feel like, to me, that if you're the console that's sort of lagging behind on this, you're going to be at a severe disadvantage. You know, so I think it is a kind of it's kind of posturing by Microsoft to do this, but also it's good. I mean, it is so immensely frustrating if there's a game that you like and the only reason you can't play it with your friend is because they happen to own a different console. That does feel very anachronistic, but also it's weird, and you know, companies are still going to want to control their own ecosystems. I mean, I think there is some sort of concern around, you know, who are the kind of people who are going to be coming over from the other service. Are they going to be good people? Are we going to be able to verify them? That kind of thing. So there's a whole bunch of issues here.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to implement. You know, what are you going to do if people from Xbox land are using racist slurs on your PlayStation service? But for me, the reason not to do this is just because it's hard enough to get all these things working really well on one platform. I feel much more strongly about this with PC console crossplay, which I really basically don't think people should try and do. And I'm sorry if that's really boring and that, you know, you really want to play your friends on the consoles, but it's so hard to make multiplayer good when you can guarantee that everyone's playing on the same kind of system. I just don't think it's worth trying, basically. And especially if you're playing against someone on the PC, that's sort of almost necessarily going to limit some of the options the PC player has, almost necessarily. Now, it's much less of a deal with Xbox and PlayStation Network, but I'd much rather that the time was spent making Xbox Live and PSN even better in terms of the services they offer than this kind of sort of red herring to me. That's a really nice idea, but I just don't think it's ever going to be an ideal solution.
Yeah, I mean, again, the extent to which you're saying it's difficult so it should never happen there is something that I feel a bit wary of, especially when something is taking off really quickly, like Rocket League. I mean, I think it would likely have been a really bad thing if Rocket League didn't have crossplay, wouldn't you say?
I think that you're gonna the problem that you've got though. Of course, it's hard and you could do it, but when you're gonna do it, you're gonna take a step back in so many other areas. You're gonna take a step back in being able to use PSN and Xbox Live for matchmaking, for party planning, the communication stuff that you have on those platforms. You're gonna take a massive step back. You're not gonna get good functionality of that stuff across the platforms. So, then you're sort of starting to say, well, sometimes I have these nice features when I'm playing with people on the same system, and sometimes I don't when I'm playing with someone on another system. So yeah, I don't care at all whether I could play Rocket League between those two systems. I know that I'm not a general party gamer, but it just seems like it's going to cause the experience to be really compromised in other areas. In a way that I don't feel is worth it.
I feel like this is something where it starts to really matter above a certain scale and not below that. So I think this is something that matters if your game is getting really, really big and you want to eliminate all the barriers to it getting even bigger. I don't think it's something that matters if your game is sort of anything like a normal-sized level of success. It is my theory on this. I mean, I just agree with everything you're saying. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be worse as an experience. That's true. Or rather, it necessarily requires the rebuilding of a load of systems unnecessarily in order to make it similar. I agree with that. That's completely true. But I definitely think that there is a requirement for this at a certain level.
Well, we can agree to disagree on that one. I think one of the other things that really gets people to go after stuff like this is the coolness of the idea that you could have leaderboards of how Xbox players are doing versus how PlayStation players are doing. And that's something that I've looked at doing with Mac and Linux and PC on our games. And the honest truth is that with any of these popular games, there's just no difference in performance. Like, it's just not true. When you've got 100,000 people playing a game, 50,000 people on Xbox, 50,000 people on PlayStation, there's just no discernible difference between those two platforms. Like, you don't get any interesting data out of that. You could probably, and there are so many other sort of more interesting avenues of game design when you think about multiplayer leaderboards, etc. So I think it's something that people have always thought was cool because there's this battle of the platform holders. I just don't think it ends up being that interesting.
I'm interested that you take this view when you're very concerned about sort of splitting multiplayer communities. And also there's, so much known stuff around the ability to do things in a social way with these games. Like, to me, there must be some essential value in this, which is not covered by it's extremely hard to do. Which is why I said, above a certain scale, it begins to matter. But you're really saying that this absolutely does not matter at any scale.
I just think that you've got to have so much diplomacy, so much like negotiation between the platform holders whenever you do this. Like, it's always going to be so much less powerful. It's like going from using the full internet to going to use like an old modem. It's like you've got such a small subset of the features that you can use, and the fact that you've just got almost no control. If you patch a game, you have to patch them at the same time on both platforms, which is really hard.
Yep.
That's going to be a much worse experience for the user base, because they have to wait for whoever's the latest platform to pass cert, for instance. And it's much worse for the PC players, because rather than being able to update a critical problem straight away via Steam, again, you have to wait for those to catch up. It's going to make it much more expensive to do improvements to multiplayer. If one platform, for some reason, the game hasn't done well on Xbox, say, at some point a developer might want to be releasing new content for PlayStation because they can afford to do that, and that makes sense, and they can't afford to do it for both. That really compromises that. There are so many issues for what, for me, is just like not a particularly good thing. And you say it becomes important when there are enough players, and I think it's even less important then, because you've already got definitely enough people to play with. For me, the fictional point at which it becomes crucial socially important is when you only have sort of 50 people on one platform and 50 people on another, and 50 people isn't enough to maintain the multiplayer ecosystem, and 100 people would be. But outside that sort of relatively rare circumstance, I just don't find it a compelling feature.
My only sort of postscript to that is that I think that there are known things to do with the way in which something spreads which require an increased number of connections between people. And with that massive generalization, I feel like there is some innate value to this. Whether that value outweighs all of the issues that you've stated there, I think is hard to know. But I'm not satisfied with the position that this is necessarily so worthless as to be, instantly possible to dismiss. That's not something that I'm satisfied with. So I guess we will disagree on that one.
Fair enough.
A company in Japan has created a device that turns a PlayStation TV into a handheld console. For just twice the price of a PS Vita, you can make your own bulky and inferior version. I feel like there's some editorializing by producer Jimmy in the way this question has been posed. As the device also has a normal HDMI input, you could also use it with a PS3. Why?
This is really pretty funny. So obviously the PlayStation TV is a Vita that doesn't have a screen that you plug into your TV.
Yeah.
And actually it seems kind of obvious in this day and age that the first thing someone would want to do with that is to connect a screen to it and turn it back into a Vita. It kind of makes complete sense to me in terms of what people are like. And you could keep on going. Yeah, exactly. You could HDMI port it and then give it another screen.
I want to be able to watch TV on it. I feel like that would be the ultimate.
It's about the size
right.
of a Nintendo NX gamepad as well. So a Nintendo Wii U gamepad.
Yeah, like the Game Gear TV tuner, but for this. That's
oh yeah, I used that.
That's the next. Oh, you did use that, didn't you? What was the user experience of the Game Gear TV tuner like?
Not excellent.
No.
As you've commented before, I'm a big. I'm really into getting TV in weird ways.
Yes, you are.
So anytime you could get like a handheld TV tuner, when I was a teenager, I was big into it. It was all right actually. As always, you had to plug the Game Gear in, otherwise it would sap your batteries in no time. But it wasn't terrible.
Well, that should make more of a comeback in this thing. I think we should move on. Chris Mootpool, founder of 4chan, has joined Google. Apparently, he will be working on their failed social network, Google+. What was wrong with producer Jimmy when he wrote these questions? Now,
that is editorializing.
That's really antagonistic. Producer Jimmy's opinions do not reflect the opinions of the podcast as a whole.
Well, he's gone down with a significant illness,
yes.
shortly after writing these. So maybe this was part of the coming down with the illness.
The inception of the influenza. What do you think about Moot joining Google?
Well, I think it's pretty interesting. On the surface of it, I'm not sure Google Plus really wants to learn that much from 4chan. But as kind of like a last-ditch attempt, this is interesting. I mean, for all of Jim's editorializing, Google Plus is not doing especially well, as far as I understand it. And this would be amazing if this guy from 4chan came in and saved it.
I mean, this is really interesting to me. Like, he's definitely he's like an indie that had a successful game, except in the social network world, and his game was the most controversial thing that could possibly have happened. So what he's going to be able to say to an existing but sort of struggling social network, I don't know. I mean, maybe he has some interesting insights. He's certainly an interesting guy. I've seen interviews with him in the past, and he definitely, is a very thoughtful guy and sort of has really considered all the implications of this thing he's created, the ultimate forum for free speech, which, of course, becomes known for its horrendous content, because if you allow humans genuinely free speech, anyone can say anything. I feel like he's an interesting person for them to have, and that's probably why they have him.
Yeah, I don't have much else to say about it. I mean, again, the older we get, the more disconnected I certainly feel from understanding what younger people are doing on social media. And as soon as it's using services that aren't Facebook and Twitter, I have no idea what's going on, or indeed what they want from those services. And I don't really know very much about 4chan. I'm sure you know a lot more about 4chan than I do. I mean, I suppose it's like, a tiny bit like Reddit. It's that kind of community. again, I don't know if what you do if you're Google and you've got Google Plus and you've put so much money in it, you don't want to just get rid of it. I'm sure they've got a few 100,000 users, I guess.
Yeah.
But I don't know how you make it relevant, and I guess you just don't want to get rid of it. But you've got to do something big. I mean, bigger than this.
Yeah, I mean, Google Plus, it has some weird sort of appendages like Hangouts, which is really useful, is technically part of Google Plus. And so I know people use it for that. I mean, yeah, so the 4chan's sort of innate appeal is full anonymity, spaces with no moderation. So you can get away with pretty much anything there. There are sort of competitors. There's 8chan, for like
Strong.
Absolutely, who really like push that to the literal limit of anonymity and full free speech. So that's always been what that's about. I mean, I do find some sort of social network behaviors of the young interesting. Snapchat is one of those things which like has completely different interactions to anything else. So Snapchat is really like the sort of the Twitter of the last few years in terms of it changes how people interact. So I find that stuff interesting, and I don't think that's sort of particularly hard to pass beyond the sort of initial confusion, which I think everyone sort of felt when Twitter came out. But again, it's like, this is such a sort of disruptive thing, to use that horrible word, that I just don't know if someone had that success in the past can know anything about it or do anything useful.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a decent punt, because basically Google Plus is such a general disaster that there's not much they can do badly. Taking some extremely long shot, high upside plays is fine, and this is really interesting. I mean, again, I feel like when I hear about this, I really feel like about how the BBC don't want people above the age of 21 listening to Radio 1. BBC have got these different radio stations and they target them quite specifically, and nowadays I think you have to be sort of a little specific with how your social network is targeted. Because for all that I would say, apart from Facebook and Twitter, but actually those aren't like amazing with the young people. Certainly they're open to competition.
Yeah.
So the question I think Google needs to answer first is what group they want to capture.
Yeah.
Is it people like me? In which case they've failed to compete with Facebook, and what they're going to do next? And they're going to pivot into being something more like Reddit. Are they just going to hire weird people and see what happens? So yeah, I mean, we've managed to spend 10 minutes talking about Google Plus, which might not be the most interesting 10 minutes of anyone's life. But if they don't do anything, nothing's going to happen.
I really agree with that. Like, you need a strong direction with your social stuff now. It has to solve a problem. The problem is no longer I don't have a way of connecting to all my friends. The problem is this specific thing about the way I connect with my friends isn't working, or I need a new way of connecting with my friends that lets me do new stuff. Those are the problems, and it will be really interesting to see if they can do something genuinely useful. Facebook is still just even plumbing the depths of getting even worse since the last time we ranted about how bad it is on this very podcast. I find it actually unusable now. I have stopped using it personally again.
Facebook is really like properly bad,
yeah.
And I really wish that it was sort of much more like Twitter. I would feel much more comfortable sort of posting things to Facebook that are sort of kind of light and like showing off some food that I cooked. I did that on Monday on Twitter, and people liked that. And the thing is, I for some reason I don't really feel comfortable doing that on Facebook. Facebook is, oddly enough, a bit too formal for me. There's something about it which seems very, very complexly social for me, and I'd like something that has the group of people I have on there, all the people I know in real life, but it's a little bit more relaxed. So I'm definitely with you. Facebook is definitely failing for me, and maybe eventually I'll go to Snapchat.
Facebook, a lot of it is about this kind of quite elaborately constructed social identity you have with your friends, and obviously people are different with different groups of their friends, so it's sort of the amalgamation of everything you think is okay for all of your friends. Or if someone has a sort of very monophonic social group who just sort of only talk about one thing, then they only talk about that thing on Facebook. And all of that it reflects really badly on people, just as the way as which on Twitter people feel compelled to raise serious issues and then get caught up by the reply system and the character limit. It's sort of the bad behavior that both of these systems encourage is a really huge turnoff. I mean, just to kind of wrap this up a little bit, I was at GDC and really enjoying spending time talking to people in the games industry and meeting lots and lots of people and being very sociable. And then I came back and I'm on games industry Twitter, and just the massive tonal difference in conversations, the massive lack of optimism and kind of general goodwill and sort of general nice social behavior on Twitter compared to in real life when you get loads of people together is so striking to me. You know, Twitter actually makes you feel depressed a lot of the time, whereas meeting loads of people who do the same thing as you in real life often makes you feel optimistic and happy. So maybe there's a social network that can capture that, perhaps.
Yeah, well, we should make that one.
Diablo 2 has had a patch that introduces better support for more recent operating systems. It's been 5 years since the last patch and 16 years since the game was originally released. Now, I'd like to talk about this, and I would also like to talk about the Diablo 1 post-mortem by Dave Breivik, which I witnessed, which is extremely interesting. So first, let's talk about, is there a need for these patches of incredibly old games?
Well, Blizzard have done this with several games very recently, I believe. Not just Diablo 2, I think they've done it with StarCraft 1 as well,
yep.
Certainly with Brood War. So they've obviously got something that they're doing. I think we talked about this a few months ago. They were hiring people to maintain their older games and to find ways to keep them relevant, which I think is very clever,
yep.
The kind of thing you'd expect Blizzard to be doing. One of the things that really annoys me, I really think that Diablo 1 is so much of a better game than Diablo 2. I don't think Diablo 2 is a bad game at all. I think it's really good. But actually a really high percentage of people, for them, Diablo 2 was their first Diablo and it's their touchstone. In some ways like StarCraft Brood War is for some people, but in a much larger way than that. And I actually think Diablo 1 is such an amazing design, and Diablo 2 is just a bloating of it. I don't think that there are many ways in which Diablo 2 is superior to Diablo 1. And I think Diablo 1 is a much slicker, better designed game. So that annoys me. That's not relevant to this discussion particularly, but I felt like saying it.
Sure. Yes, there's this whole rumor that they're gearing up to do these remasters. And that kind of issue becomes really important because if you like, the original one, and it says here, this PC Gamer article, we speculated then that Blizz could be ramping up to remaster greats like Diablo 2, Warcraft 3, and StarCraft. So if you are, there will be people who agree with you, surprisingly, who are in the Diablo 1 camp, who want that one remastered. So you kind of open that old can of worms, who preferred which ancient thing.
Yeah, exactly. But, to get back to the core topic, I think it's really good that Blizzard are doing this. I slightly imagine that the stuff that they're doing isn't as interesting to me as some of the things they could be doing. Like if they actually made just an expansion pack for Diablo 2, that would be awesome. I'd buy that straight away. In-engine, like a proper expansion to a very old game. I'm sure that's not what they're doing.
No.
But that's what I'm hoping for.
A remaster, I would really like a remaster. I just finished the Day of the Tentacle remaster, which I basically just exclusively loved. I loved everything they did with it. I found, this art style problem that everyone has. It just ignored it. It's at a sufficient distance from my head that the new art style didn't annoy me, and the old art style is there as well if you really care. I don't think you can do any better than that. It's a fantastic game, and it really, really, really stands up in the modern environment. I didn't know if it would, but it absolutely does. It's better than a lot of contemporary games in that genre. So remasters, I think, making these important games available to the current generation in a good, solid way, I think is brilliant and should be encouraged.
Yeah, I thought that the faces were a bit weak on the new Day of the Tentacle. I thought the environments were good. I don't think that just being able to go back to the old style actually in any way makes you sort of immune to criticism of your new artwork in an HD remaster, because the reason you're remastering it to a certain extent is because, unfortunately, even Day of the Tentacle's art does look a bit funny and low resolution and old now. So I think that just being able to go back to the original doesn't really have an impact on whether, the criticism of the new stuff. But I agree, it certainly wasn't as bad as it looked when they first announced it.
Yeah.
And it's such an amazing game. I'm kind of excited it's on my Vita.
So there's this problem with shading and stuff on the faces, and I really struggle to care. You know, it's not going to be to do something which is going to satisfy everyone that involves adding detail is not going to work. So, and this is kind of the point I made originally, which was poo-pooed. It's like, I really feel they've come through with this thing that is the most neutral way they could go. Doing anything else, they'd have to take a strong stylistic direction, and that's just going to alienate people. And you're right, putting the old art in isn't going to placate those people. So I actually just am completely satisfied with this. I don't think there's any way that they could sensibly or easily have made it any better. And it's sufficient that you can just focus on the game. You can focus on the puzzles, the incredible design, and the writing, and it's not something that gets in the way of that experience.
Well, no, I actually am on board with the idea that this was the best paradigm that they could have taken. I agree that anything, in a different paradigm, anything more stylized would have been much more divisive. But I don't think it's perfect. I think it could be a little better.
Sure.
This actually, I can make a link between this game and Diablo 1. Both these games take place in one quite small location, and I've always been a huge fan of that.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I much prefer Half-Life 1 to Half-Life 2, I really hate it when games can just go to somewhere completely different at every level. And I love it when a game takes time to really fully model, fully explore, sort of play with your expectations of one location. Diablo 1, you just had the cathedral and then the 16 levels below it and the village around it. And just the fact that you had that sort of very small overworld, but that had like little nooks and crannies, was so much more exciting and valuable because it wasn't one of 16 completely different locations. It was one kind of side location.
Right.
And Day of the Tentacle, 3 different times in one location is amazing.
Yes.
And needs to be done by more games.
This is really, really important because there's this aesthetic, stylistic thing. You have movies and so on that are set in small locations and single rooms and things like that, and it's underexplored because I think when someone gets the ability to create something, they want to have this huge thing, and imagining new parts of the thing is exciting. So keeping that constrained can be very creatively difficult. But also in Day of the Tentacle, obviously, it's a great design move because it eliminates the problem in point and click games where there are unexpected locations, so you don't know you can walk off a screen. It's still, I don't say eliminate, it has a little bit of that. There are some slightly odd locations and some slight differences between the time zones, but fundamentally you know where everything is. And it turns out that's actually just annoying in a point and click game. That element of the exploration is not fun. Like, is there a room here is not an interesting question. Sure, like what's going to be around the next corner is interesting, but it just solves that problem. And I really, really wish that there would be an equivalent solution to the kind of logic-breaking puzzle problem, which it still falls afoul of. So if someone can come up with an innovation for that's also cool, then please do that.
Yeah, I think that the exciting thing is which bits of this clearly defined area have they decided to show.
Yeah.
So I think about the first world in Grim Fandango when I think about this, which I think did a decent job. It's a skyscraper, and it's got really nice bit of the garage, interesting outside sections. Definitely felt like it was kind of one location just for that. Not as comprehensively done as Day of the Tentacle. One of the best things about Day of the Tentacle is that the house is so small, really.
Yes.
It's only got a few rooms, but they managed to make the different areas of it feel really distinct.
Yep.
Which is something that I think you see a bit, funnily enough, on Spectrum games. I don't know why that is, but there's something so great about that. I agree with you about the puzzles. The puzzles always have seemed to be like a bit of a necessary evil with point and clicks, which I'm kind of getting more and more fond of. I was a huge fan when I was an early teenager, and I was remembering fondly the Discworld 1 and 2 and Noir point and click games. And I'm intrigued by how living and how they set out a completely new set of rules for one location. And that's really exciting. And the puzzles are kind of the negative aspect of that. The most recent point-and-click game I've played is Machinarium, which is excellent.
Yeah.
Although a little dry, and the puzzles sort of, it's just such hard work. And that's definitely a problem. But maybe, it's something I'm interested in exploring as a designer.
I think that design innovation in point and click is something that's really sorely needed. I mean, Her Story actually it has a wonderful mechanical innovation, the searching thing. Everyone knows how to search, text strings. It's just so great that you can kind of move through the puzzles we're using that, and that mechanic sort of implied a load of the other things about the design, which is really, really great. So yeah, I really think adventure games and story-based games need some innovation. We're going to talk about episodic games in a minute, so I may consolidate that into that topic. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things in the Diablo post-mortem before we move on from this epic topic. One of them that really amused me was that Dave Brevik, the lead designer and the owner of the company that made it. So this wasn't actually Blizzard who originated this. He pitched this to Blizzard and they published it from his company. So he always envisaged the game as a turn-based game. He was very into traditional roguelikes like NetHack, and he was very adamant it would be turn-based. And Blizzard sort of turned around at one point and said, hey, you should make it real-time. And he said, no, I'm absolutely not doing that. And all of his team kind of started talking, and there was a sort of a real-time camp and a turn-based camp, and then the turn-based camp sort of was whittled down to just him, and the real-time camp was the rest of the team, and he said absolutely no, and they took a vote, and he was outvoted like 19-1 or whatever, and he went fine. So he phoned up Blizzard and said, hey, we're going to make it real-time, but you have to give me an extra milestone, and you have to pay me a huge amount of money right now, because it's going to take ages and derail the whole project. And they went, okay, Dave, that's cool. And he got really angry that they said yes. And he went to his computer, sat down, and changed the length of a turn to a fraction of a second, and the game instantly became real-time and ran fine. And that story is just so wonderful to me. Like, that's so... Hearing him talk, all of the problems that he had in developing that game, they had this really terrible system for rendering the walls, which was completely the wrong paradigm and made everything take 20 times longer to do. And nobody ended up fixing it because they were so far into content. It's just the same as it is now. These old classic games just had the same disasters, the same kind of lack of foresight that any great game that happens now. So I found all of that completely fascinating.
Creating a new genre is just a sort of a hideous adventure, really.
Yeah.
It's just it's the stories of the ones that work are all in some ways the same. It's just you keep going down weird dark alleys and you overcome weird problems, and the only thing they have in common really is tenacity to get to the end.
Yeah, but for such a game that invented a genre, this reluctant creator, and he said that the second he saw the character run across the screen and like hit a skeleton, he went, "Oh wow, this is amazing!" So he was instantly converted out of his grumpiness by actually seeing the thing work. Brilliant.
That's nice.
In a piece for Eurogamer a couple of weeks ago, Martin Robinson made the case for episodic games being a potential solution for ever-increasing budgets. He believes that recent games such as Ground Zero and the new Hitman have made smaller, more focused games acceptable. Has the games industry finally cracked the episodic model?
Well, no, I don't think it has, but it's an interesting step on the path. But I think that there's some problems with this concept that I'm going to get to right now. So the two games that we're really talking about here are Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes, which was the weird kind of little prequel level that they sold / gave away free with PS Plus for the Phantom Pain. Metal Gear Solid 5, an amazing game. And yes, we're talking about the new Episode 1 of the Hitman game. These both appear to be of a similar scope, in that it's really quite a big, fully modelled level with lots and lots of different things you can do, lots of different paths. And this is something that I've talked about before. I absolutely love small open worlds. Very, very well modelled smaller areas. It's kind of a little bit similar to the thing we were just talking about right now. It's something that I quite like in the Dark Souls series. Demon Souls, that they kind of have a really detailed, fairly small open world. I think it's kind of so much more interesting than just the morass of GTA 5, etc. But there's a problem with this as an episodic thing, which is that you've got to have made a very, very fully featured game for this to work. When you talk about the adventure games, what's interesting about the adventure point-and-click format is that the rules are basically governed by the scripting of the puzzles. Yeah. You were talking about Her Story and this search mechanic, and various different point-and-clicks have sort of little mini mechanics which define a lot of them. But basically, the language of the puzzles is something that's built up by the game, and it's pretty different for every single different game, and it's one of the things which makes them so unique. And obviously, if you're making a game like Metal Gear Solid, in order to make one level of something really interesting in the way that both Ground Zeroes and apparently this Hitman thing is, the game has to be very, very solid, very, very fully featured. So I'm not sure it's really the answer per se, because so much of the work has to be done before you can ever release this one episode. It would then be insane to only release one, obviously. So you're still going to end up releasing something that's of a similar length, I think.
Yeah, I mean, also, yes, it's very telling that both of these games are based on games, they're sequels. They're things where the gameplay is fundamentally known. Also, you've got, the Telltale games and Life is Strange, which is basically a kind of evolution of the Telltale structure without some of the terrible elements of those games. And that can work because it's, they're very puzzle-light, narrative-driven games. So they kind of have a narrative serial format where they end on a cliffhanger, and all you have to do is kind of map out the story arc as you go through. And also, some of those games sort of change direction in the middle. There's some jokes in Life is Strange about some of the bad puzzles in one of the early episodes after they kind of moved heavily away from that puzzle direction, that kind of thing. So you can work things out as you go. I mean, yeah, for these big AAA episodic games, I feel a bit confused by it. I'm slightly put off by the Hitman thing in some ways. Like, I don't know when the next one's going to come out, so do I want to invest the time in this one and have to wait a really long time for the next one? Is the next one going to be as good? All of those old traditional problems, it's just something not quite there for me with this.
Yeah, and I basically agree, and I think there's something fundamentally unattractive about it being episodic. I think that there's something really great about both Ground Zeroes and Episode 1 of this Hitman thing, but I don't think it's because they're episodes. I think that there's something so compelling about being given the full fidelity of a gigantic quadruple A release in a tiny environment. And feeling like, and basically just getting more fidelity than you get in a Call of Duty level or anything like that. I think that's really exciting. And there's something really cool about it being the first time that you get your hands on these new systems as well. As little kind of sort of teaser episodes, I guess you'd say. I think it really works. But again, am I going to enjoy episode 3? Like, I'm very novelty based. Like, I want a game to come out. I want to get really excited about it, get all the hype, start playing it, get as far through it as I can, get really excited by it, and then stop. That's kind of the pattern with which I play games. That was what I did with Metal Gear Solid 5. It was excellent. And this idea that I'm going to be playing this game and then I'm going to forget all the things I'm doing with it, and then in 3 months something else is going to come out, I think is really fundamentally unattractive. But I am so just go back to sort of what I was saying about the rules of these things. I'm so obsessed as a designer right now with making games that have systems of rules that people don't understand yet, and that are completely new, and that you want to be able to have your cake and eat it. You want to be able to make a game that's genuinely new, but you don't want to have to spend $200 million on making all of the content that Phantom Pain has. And I think that this is showing that people are really willing to engage with these kind of small environments. It doesn't even have to be a long game. Walking simulators show as well that people are just sort of really getting on board with that kind of thing. So I think these are really great harbingers in gaming. I just don't think they're great harbingers of episodic gaming.
Alrighty. Daybreak Games have stopped work on EverQuest Next. According to the company, as the game came together, it became clear that it, quote, wasn't fun, close quote. Apparently, the voxel-based crafting MMO EverQuest Landmark is still in production. Should EverQuest just lay down and die?
This is actually pretty big. Like, I definitely wanted to bring this up because I didn't want them to be allowed to just disappear quietly into the night. I don't know if you remember, there was a time when EverQuest Next was a huge deal. They had like a big demo. The videos looked amazing. They were super confident that this was going to be so disruptive. And that was a long time ago, and now it's basically dead. They're releasing this weird side project, which is all the creativity stuff. And I just want to kind of mark the passing of this really exciting game that definitely languished in development hell, and I'm just kind of a bit critical of this. I think that they had some really interesting stuff going on, and I think it was probably bad management that led to it not happening.
Yeah, we're still seeing this thing of like, I feel like there are these projects where there's so many constraints on them that you can't do the game development process properly. You can't do the iteration on gameplay. You can't do the core stuff. I mean, I think the Star Wars MMO really suffered from that as well. The most recent one, name of which escapes me, where they just didn't.
Yeah.
There was so much pressure on all of these secondary things that the game wasn't fun. You know, you can't spend this much money on a project and then find out it's not fun. Why does this keep happening? Why can't developers be allowed to do the development process properly?
The Old Republic is, I guess, the game you were looking for.
That is correct.
I mean, you know, it's especially bad. It's egregiously bad in MMOs where, you know, just to create a competitive skeleton of an MMO game, you have to spend 2 years and have 150 employees. Like, it's absolutely mad. You know, the Division, which sort of managed to, I think, hide from the world that it was an MMO, really. Like, it's basically a very, very much something like Destiny, and Destiny is basically kind of a modern MMO.
Yeah.
You know, if you just think about the only games that are getting any attention, it's these ginormous IPs or these ginormous projects. And, you know, EverQuest, I think it was probably like a little bit of an indie in the end, you know, trying to do it. And I think it's a terrible idea. I would never suggest anyone make an MMO. And I guess this EverQuest Next Landmark thing, this like attempt to take the good stuff from EverQuest Next and make it into a product that can actually be sold, that might work. It should have happened earlier, I think. But I don't know if anyone listening to this remembers the really exciting videos, the really exciting beta stuff that they had. They showed it off at a load of shows. The building was really disruptive for MMOs. But there's something quite depressing about the fact that this is getting cancelled, whereas Shroud of the Avatar, which I've been playing a little bit, you know, which really couldn't be more conservative, it has to be said. You know, it's not as conservative as World of Warcraft or anything, but you know, it's just kind of sad. But really, the MMO landscape is a wasteland.
Yeah, absolutely. I know, it's so hard to imagine something that would bring me back into playing MMOs, and certainly a lot of people. I mean, we're going to be talking about Destiny in the next topic, but I felt like it's weird that that's sort of the innovation that's kind of worked, whereas this has just got snarled up in its own ambition, and this crafting thing, you know.
Crafting.
It's such a saturated thing, like, and it's so difficult to know what will work in a saturated thing. Perhaps even harder to know that than what will work in a kind of a vacuum, because it's sort of so much based around people's expectations and how it relates to other things and all of that. So, I also agree. Like, I think it's a shame that this didn't really reach the point of becoming anything real when it set out to be genuinely disruptive. But maybe MMOs are so sort of ossified now you can't do that.
Yeah, just to close off, it is really sad. And if there was anything that was going to really disrupt MMO stuff from within, I kind of thought it might be EverQuest. Because it was a name that had enough fans, that had enough of an individual sort of design of its own. And then it was doing something very new as well. I thought it might actually make something that I was vaguely interested to play. But that did not come to pass.
According to Chris Thurston, the Division is being held back by a conflict between the game's design and its setting. He believes that by adopting the somewhat realistic environment of games like DayZ and the RPG mechanics of Destiny, the game is stuck halfway between worlds. Did you agree with that criticism? And if not, is there a different problem that's afflicting the Division?
Well, unfortunately, I haven't played it, so I'm not talking from a position of great strength here, of great authority. I think it's interesting that this is the next Destiny. Destiny was obviously kind of much less successful than they hoped, I feel, but still significantly successful. People have bought The Division a lot. Every single review I read is the same, which is basically, I played it for 60 hours, I enjoyed the whole time I was playing for it, I'm still not sure if I like it or not. Every review basically said that. And I think we're getting closer and closer to this sort of addictive loop, this Skinner's box, as people like to call it, being actually a crutch for games in the wrong way. I think at some point people have got to say the addictiveness that you're using now is actually too refined. it's too cynically about the addictive feeling that you have playing these games. I experienced it playing Fallout 4, for instance. I think probably everyone listening to this knows what I mean. When you play a game and you kind of really get into the addictiveness loop of it, it's really nice. While you're in it, it's pleasurable. But sometimes, often, nonetheless, you step out and you're like, wow, that was all complete nonsense.
Yeah.
You don't want to get back into it. And I really think that, I honestly think it's gone too far. And actually, I can bring this right back to Diablo 1 and Diablo 2. Diablo 2, all it really did was add new slots for you to put things on. Suddenly you had thigh pads, you had more rings that you could put on, etc., etc., etc. And that actually wasn't necessary. That was just kind of refining the active ingredient to the point where it stopped being like an interesting gourmet meal or whatever, and started just being like over chocolating everything. And
okay.
I kind of think that's where we're going.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry about that analogy.
Over chocolating is my new verb.
But yeah, no, I think there's a real lack of balance here, and I think that people have now worked out how to get you to feel addicted like that. And I think that I do think that players will start reacting against that. In fact, I think that's what's happening with the reaction to The Division.
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic. I agree with all of that. I think people have used the term RPGification. I feel that does violence to the traditional idea of an RPG, but let's go with that for now. All of this stuff is the weird thing is that players always ask for it. Someone on Twitter made this really good comment, like the RPG elements are the first thing that everyone asks for. Are there going to be levels? Are there going to be crafting? Are there going to be these things? Are there going to be that thing? And it's just that's when everyone is asking for it, it becomes this new norm, this new expectation. And you're right, I think it's got refined to the point where if you look at how Destiny worked, we covered that topic about how they spent a really long time refining that and kind of looking at all the data to create that and so on in Destiny. It's just going to be the sort of baseline of all these games. To bring this back to the topic a little bit, Chris Thurston, at the end of this piece, he starts to talk about the setting, and he says you're not going to get meaningful diversity from M4A1s and AK-47s. You're not going to get it from enemies who can only be regular people, and you're not going to get it from gadgets and abilities that stem from the question, what if Google Glass could help you kill people? So he's really saying that there's kind of a lack of imagination in the design, in minor elements of the design, that's caused by the setting. And I find that really interesting. He's saying they won't ever add mechs. Do you buy that?
I don't actually buy that. I think that everyone has the kind of aesthetic worlds they like. So that's the kind of criticism I would give to a fantasy world. But fantasy worlds have as many options open to them as sci-fi worlds. And I've met people who think that endless AIs being the bad guys or factions in sci-fi books is incredibly boring to them, much more boring than the next kind of orcs, and I'm the opposite. So I think it's completely personal. I think you can find as much detail use you like in modern day weaponry and in sort of modern day hacking. I think if you happen to prefer the Destiny science fiction stuff, which I probably do, it sounds that Chris Thurston does, and that's just going to be something that you can't really get over. I mean, if you want it to be a science fiction game, then it's not, and that's just kind of going to be not as good for you.
I think, though, that there is something to the assertion that if you're trying to make something somewhat realistic, you can't then... It's really hard to justify kind of big, weird new systems.
That's probably fair. I mean, The Division is set after a viral outbreak that kills sort of most of humanity, so it's not exactly limited by the same things that an episode of EastEnders is limited by, for instance. But sure, you can't suddenly have a mech emerging out of nowhere. It's not particularly high on the fantastical scale.
Yeah.
But then... this is a bad example, I suppose, but Metal Gear Solid has managed to make that kind of area with some really fantastical stuff, be perfect, and it can do whatever it wants. So again, it's kind of what you prefer. Like, I think that GoldenEye, the game, has some stuff in it which feels incredibly fantastical, despite working perfectly within the aesthetic bounds of being sort of a Cold War spy story.
Well, I mean, it's the James Bond universe, though.
Sure. So, Tom Clancy's universe has some pretty funny stuff going on. I've read quite a few Tom Clancy books when I was younger and much more foolish than I am now. And as much as he tries to be about what is completely plausible in modern day technology, in every book he'll do a couple of things which are pretty out there. I think he's got some sort of flying bases that stay up there for a long time. Right? I'm not trying to talk at massive odds to this. You're right, a gigantic 200-foot mech cannot break through the Statue of Liberty and rescue the Division from being boring, I suppose. But on the other hand, all the other MMOs are really fantastical, so it's really nice to see one that's like this.
Yeah. Rock Paper Shotgun published a list of the 15 best space games last week. Included in the list were Descent, Elite Dangerous, X3, and Hard War. Is this a pretty comprehensive list, or are there some glaring omissions?
Hard War, there are definitely some glaring omissions. It's been so long since I added this topic, I can't remember what they are. But I remember reading it and thinking, there is definitely some glaring omissions here.
Well, I can kick you off with one. The obvious one that I'm going to say is Wing Commander Privateer, which is entirely absent and came before loads of these games, like Freelancer, which I think is Freelancer 2, which I think is the #1 game. It's such a maligned game that languishes in obscurity. I desperately want it to get more coverage. I think it's a really important game.
I think the #1 game is actually quite rightly Free Space 2.
Oh, Free Space 2, that's right.
Which is, for my money, actually the best space game, although it's not particularly freeform. They decided to include Descent in this list, which I thought was an interesting call, i.e. an incorrect call. But we should talk about Hard War, man. There's been some loving on my Twitter feed towards Hard War.
Yeah.
And I think even who was it? Yes, someone. I think Chris England was talking about being interested in redoing it.
Yeah.
I was slightly surprised that Strike Suit Zero was in this list.
Yeah.
We're actually really good friends with the guys behind Strike Suit Zero.
Yep.
But I didn't get very far with it.
I mean, I liked it, but yes, is it an all-time classic space game? I'm sure they're happy it's up there. So, I mean, but compared to Privateer, no. I'm just that terrible person who will only harp on the one thing they like not being included. But it's weird, and it's such a strange genre, space games. It's at the same time, you'd think it would be one of the most liberating genres, but in fact, it's quite restricted. And does this have EVE online in this list?
Yeah, I think maybe they left that out for some reason. I think that was possibly on the honorable mentions. I'm not sure why they wouldn't include that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Hard War isn't actually set in space.
No, it's not a space game.
Yeah, it's very much kind of a version of Elite, though.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of less bothered by it being here. And for me, it's so much more satisfying to not be set in space. Because space has no boundaries.
Yeah.
The game has to put sort of artificial boundaries that are much more artificial than even games' usual boundaries, which are usually extremely artificial, and that really bothers me. I like to have sort of very well-defined space to play in, which is why one of the reasons I really like Hard War, and one of the reasons that I get turned off. It's really nice, the idea of being so free, but until you get the level of fidelity that, say, Elite Dangerous has, I find it empty and hollow. Whereas, I think Elite Dangerous does get there in terms of being comprehensive enough. So
yeah, and that's a thing with Privateer for me as well, is that every system, it had the Wing Commander sort of paradigm, so you could only get to one system from another. So it was just a network, and you had to look at the map to see where you could jump to from each system. And each system had its own character. Like some were kind of really on the frontier of the war, and you'd see big capital ships. Some were quiet mining systems where nobody ever went. Some were big commercial systems with a lot of traffic. So as soon as you arrived in a system, you could tell just by the traffic around the jump gate what kind of thing it was going to be, and the sort of planets that you might find there. And it was quite constrained and quite scripted, and that just made it feel really characterful. Elite is the ultimate kind of big, open, random, sort of numbers-based space game where the stories emerge from the systems, and Privateer was about a story in space that you were flying around, but yet you had freedom of movement and freedom to encounter sort of things in any order. And for me, that was the ultimate combination. And I really think space games should look into this characterful thing a lot more. No Homeworld on this list as well.
Yeah, so an unusual list. Just to finish off, though, we have to give a shout out to one of the honourable mentions in the subcategory of Hard War, which is a game called Subwar 2050, which
Yes.
is one of my favourite early 90s games. Actually, a lot more people than I thought have played it and really liked it on Twitter as well. If you've never heard of Subwar 2050, try and find it on YouTube. It's really an awesome game and something else that could do with an indie remake.
Ark Survival Evolved developer Studio Wildcard is being sued by Trendy Entertainment. The plaintiff alleges that one of their former employees has violated a non-compete agreement by joining Wildcard. Legal troubles, Ian Hardingham.
Yeah, not that sexy a complaint, is it? I just feel like we have every time these massively successful indie games have some kind of legal dispute, some kind of like handbag flapping. We should talk about it just to make sure people know that it's not all fun and games at the top. Sometimes bad things happen.
Yeah,
I've got nothing else to say about this, really. It doesn't look very exciting.
Well, these non-compete clauses, man, like I think games companies really just go out of their way to try and absolutely control their employees and sort of own everything that they do and define their future and so on. And with this indie
There's
culture,
a word for that.
Yeah, this indie
It's
culture
slavery.
is absolutely terrible. So I just think that if you're going into a game development position at a company, you need to really look at the contract. You need to think about what's going to happen in 10, 15 years if you want to go and make your own game. What's going to happen if you want to make your game in your spare time? You know, good employers will let you negotiate these things, and they'll let you have space to be a human being. And if your employer is not doing that, they are a bad employer, and you shouldn't work for them. This needs to become the industry standard where people are able to do things in a reasonable way. Of course, there's going to be some restrictions. You know, employers aren't going to want you spending all of your time on your pet project at work when you're supposed to be working. But for goodness sake, like let's get this sorted out, mainstream games industry.
Wow, I'm glad you brought your A game to this topic, because I definitely didn't.
Those are my thoughts. Japanese to English translator Zach Davison wrote an article for the Comics Journal recently about the process of translation, specifically about how fundamental and creative changes often need to be made in order to maintain the spirit of the original work in another language. Translation, Ian Hardingham.
I think translation is like a really super interesting part of games. I'm always really interested to think about the fact that you have to make a load of creative decisions as a translator to retain the spirit of a joke, especially a joke, or a feeling that you want to transfer. I mean, I've always thought that. I honestly, and I'm kind of hoping you disagree with this. I honestly think that a lot of the spirit of a work must be lost in translation. I sort of think that there's so much detail and so much kind of subconsciously going on when a writer is writing, something's, a book, for instance, that has all this stuff that they want to communicate, that a lot of the things that they're talking about are based very much on the society that they're living in, etc., etc. It just feels impossible to me that so much wouldn't be lost. And what is interesting to me that I feel about games and I don't feel about books. I don't feel sad that I can't read all these Japanese books, but I do feel sad that I couldn't go and play a really interesting old Japanese computer game. Now, that's probably because I'm more into computer games than books, although I'm pretty into books. I don't know if there's some aspect of games that makes that so. It seems silly that language would be a barrier when there's so little language in a lot of these games I'm interested in playing, or if it's just like a non-difference. But translation.
Oh, I think the thing with games is that the other work is lost to you that comprises the game.
Yeah.
So it's not just, the text, it's the design. You can't experience the design because of the text, which seems weird, because
right,
you should
definitely.
Be able to. So I think that's what's going on there. I mean, translation was always traditionally seen as a creative form in its own right. People would write their translation of Virgil, or they'd write their translation of, Beowulf has been a popular one. There've been some recent modern translations of Beowulf. The classics of literature, that's what you did when you were an educated person. You had your classical education, you had your your Latin and Greek, at least, and then you would write your own translation. And that's completely lost because, obviously classics aren't valued very much now because there's a lot of other things that you need to learn to be in modern society. So they're kind of more of a niche subject. But certainly in sort of arts fields, it's generally considered to be good to have another language to a reasonable level and to understand sort of at least a passing understanding of classical stuff. And translation's really interesting. I really think this is a great article. If you think that translation is like this kind of mechanical thing where you just replace words with other words, if you're that kind of person, you should read this article because it really isn't. It's a creative form. I read something about literary translation recently, which was written by Murakami's translator, and he was saying, people don't understand that when they're reading these books, they're reading me. They're not reading Murakami. It's something that's gone through another person's filter, and that's why it's really interesting. A great translator can really provide a lot of their own creative input and create a sort of completely new work, which is really cool. But you're not reading the original thing.
Yeah, well, I think you've pretty much covered everything there. It is a great article, and it's a really super interesting area. And of course, you've hit the nail on the head. There's so much content in the game that isn't to do with the text, and as games connoisseurs, you don't want to feel that you cannot experience something that might be really important to the gaming scene. So, good on the people who do it.
I love the idea of games connoisseurs. Okay, that's the final topic of this part of the show now, and it's going to be a difficult one. Fans have complained today after Blizzard removed a pose from an Overwatch character after fan complaints. Fans complaining about things and then fans complaining. The victory pose over shoulder displays the Tracer character looking backwards towards the camera with her bottom in the center of the frame. Is there a way in which it's possible to have a reasonable discussion about these issues, or has the conversation broken down irrevocably?
Now, we haven't done this podcast for a couple of weeks because you've been away.
Yes.
And some of these topics are a little older because I decided that what we would do for this podcast is use all the interesting topics that we came up with a couple of weeks ago.
Yep.
And then hopefully we do an episode of the podcast in the not distant future, maybe even this week, that catches up with all of the important things that have happened last week.
Right.
Among the important things that we are going to talk about are the launch of the Oculus Rift, the real launch.
Yep.
The fact that PlayStation 4.5 is a thing that's coming out this year.
Yep.
And the most amazing hoax that I've seen in my lifetime of what the Nintendo NX controller was supposed to look like.
Yeah.
However, you have decided that the only one of the modern stories that should come into this episode is this one about someone's ass on Overwatch.
This was today.
And I'm really glad that I've spent that long preambling this because there's nothing else to say about this ludicrosity. Everything has definitely broken down. I have no problem with people giving Blizzard a hard time about sexualizing female characters. This particular female character offends me personally hugely because the trousers that she's wearing are kind of, her legs are extremely long in a way that I find weird. The yellow tint is really annoying, and the ass is shown in a way that I think goes beyond sexualization to just idiocy. So for me, this isn't even kind of, gigantic boob woman with a gun. This is just now just a really weird image.
I'm really struggling with this issue at this point now, because we're having a situation where every time something like this comes up, there is a very similar discussion which plays out along these very predefined lines. So there's stuff like people will say it's a fantastical game, so it doesn't matter if it's unrealistic. Completely missing the point that mimesis and realism are not things which are globally applied in all aesthetics. As if that is a law by which you should judge any decision is how realistic it's supposed to be. So that happens. Then people say, oh, it's this terrible sexualization of all female video game characters that's pervaded the games industry and it must be arrested and combated at every turn, which is fine. And then there's people saying, oh, you can't say which type of clothes a female character can wear because that's too prescriptive and you're trying to define the ways in which women should present themselves. And then there's that. And then there's a huge line of people who just say it's only a game and it doesn't matter and everyone should shut up. And then there's people who will come in and comment on it as you did aesthetically. And I think that we might have hit a point now where all discussion of this is impossible. And I think we've got there systematically over the last couple of years. And I find that really sad and really, really concerning.
Well, I think that you've described the situation well, but I coming to a different conclusion to you. I'm in complete agreement with all of the symptoms that you list. I think it's reasonably positive because I think I'm basically for there being a period where you don't sexualize women in silly action games. Like, I think that you kind of have to go too far to get back to where would be a good place to be. And I don't particularly have a problem with Blizzard having to change some things because of a backlash. I think that in broad terms, and this is a opinion which not everyone agrees with. I understand that, and I've talked about this a lot of times. This is something I basically believe in. A lot of people have told me they think is wrong. I think that sometimes you have deep-seated societal or otherwise prejudice, and the only way of changing it is for the persecuted group or maybe some other group to be unreasonable for a long period of time. I think that it's actually part of the process that you have to be unreasonable about something for a period of time, and then everyone kind of changes, and eventually you can stop being unreasonable because there's been just like a basic change. And I'm fine with that happening. I think that given that is happening, then yeah, you're not going to have any good discussion about it because the side I'm kind of on the side with is already being unreasonable. And everyone else is certainly going to get extremely angry about being criticised, about having the thing that they do to relax criticised. And when they are not a member of the persecuted group, they have no idea what's going on. They think it's just a load of nonsense. So I'm not surprised that it's a cluster F on the internet. I just don't know if it's necessarily a bad situation.
I do disagree with this because I think that you're basically saying that you can only resolve these things with massive, sort of disastrous entropy. And I really think that's a very dangerous view because you're basically saying that there's no hope for reason in any major social situation. And that
I think that's going way too far. I think that there are loads and loads of situations where reason is the right solution. But I think that if you're coming at basically kind of subconscious based prejudices that have just been kind of part of a previous age that you happen to grow up in, I'm not sure that I think that just talking reasonably about it ever gets to the actual full change. I think that if you have kind of these deep-seated prejudices that you don't even know about, then you are actually unable to come to the right conclusion reasonably because you think you're being reasonable when you're not. And that's why the only effective thing against that is to just kind of have a sort of a blanket, we do not want this to happen, this is not about freedom of speech, please stop doing this, we are the persecuted group approach.
Well, again, I just find that depressing because I think a healthier way of processing those things is to become aware of them and then to start understanding them rationally. I don't think you need to have a kind of a collision of your subconsciously held prejudices with another equally unreasonable force from someone else's unconsciously held beliefs in order to change your opinion. That seems like that you can only change your opinion through basically violent conflict. And that's not
well, but
good,
it's not basically violent conflict though. I know why you say that, but it's not actually violent. It is a pity that the kind of the people on the side of the persecuted group have to be so extreme and use a lot of incredibly negative tactics, which absolutely literally close down discussion. That's what they do. I've spent a lot of my life finding it incredibly offensive, but then I noticed a change happening in myself that I don't think would have happened otherwise. So I bought some respect for it, and you know I think that it does require forceful a thing which really bothers you is often the quickest way of getting you to change. Like something that is really affronting, that makes you angry. I mean, anger is part of the method of change. And I hate there being a situation, just like you do, where you can't have a rational discussion about whether or not Blizzard should be allowed to have this character. But I think that, yeah, I think I've said my piece on it. When something is so big and so rooted, and you do want it to change and it not to take 300 years, I think it's okay to give up that, I suppose.
Oh, the one who annoys you is your greatest teacher. Good. That's enough of that. I think we talked enough about Hard War that we can satisfactorily move on, unless you have anything else to say about it.
That's true. Hard War was supposed to be something we're talking about right now, but it's not, so...
I would like to move gently into the film and television lounge area. We don't need to spend a huge amount of time on this because this is already an epic podcast. But I'd like to talk about the show Flaked, which is
Did you
on
watch
Netflix.
some of it?
I've been watching quite a lot of Flaked, yes.
Okay.
So it's Will Arnott, who was Job in Arrested Development, and this is a kind of lightly comic, sort of easygoing, dramatic series set in Venice in LA, and he is this kind of washed-up alcoholic guy, and it's about him and his friends. It reminds me a lot of Master of None without the same level of kind of hard-hitting gags. And it's kind of a nothingy show. It's quite sort of washed out and dreamlike, and it's an interesting thing.
Right. Actually, I want to take a bit of issue with some of the language you used there. I'm not sure. I think it's quite fair to call him a washed-up alcoholic, actually, because one of the reasons I found this show interesting is he's someone who hasn't drunk for 12 years since he killed someone while drink driving. And actually, what I found quite refreshing was to have like a functionally non-drinking person as the lead character of a show. And all of his friends are people who are actually in AA, and his culture is kind of around sort of the church of not drinking, which I found sort of interestingly different. I definitely agree that it's sort of slow and a little bit nothing. It does actually, more things happen near the end. I really like the palette that it's drawn with, both visually and the kind of interactions that happen. I think there's plenty wrong with it, but I did really enjoy watching it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel like he fairly broadly fits the stereotype, though, because he has this kind of useless non-business that he kind of runs. He cycles sort of aimlessly around, disappointing people and getting things wrong and just being a bit of a loser. And he sort of immediately starts covertly drinking in the second episode. So it's sort of, I didn't really feel like that was a novel characterization.
Yeah, I kind of... First, spoilers. Second, the show is kind of all about... That I think that is a spoiler, isn't it?
It's kind of completely inevitable.
Yeah, and I thought that was actually... Well, there's an interesting thing at the end where I feel that it could have ended on either of the last two episodes. The penultimate episode has an extremely happy ending that literally looks exactly like it could be the ending of the show.
Right. And
then the final episode has a pretty unhappy ending. A lot of the show is about him trying to maintain his life. Like he doesn't make any money with his furniture shop, but it's extremely important to him. But you know, it's fair enough. I did actually kind of appreciate it being a little bit different, but we often disagree about whether something is of a stereotype or not. But yeah, no, I enjoyed it.
The new thing for me is that I normally really badly want shows like this to be funnier, but I don't with this, because this is very much about the humor playing a role of motivating scenes and getting you through scenes. And it's got a bit of like some Larry David-isms in there where something will be set up and it's broadly farcical. So that, again, but that kind of is more structural than it is the thing's primary aim. But it's all done well. So I think as long as the comedic elements are executed well, then maybe my desire for the frequency and intensity of them to be constant is sort of less high than it used to be. And that's the new thing for me.
Yeah, it felt extremely like a lot of the indie films that I like. Sort of slow-moving, reflective, there are a lot of films like that, and they're something that I'm drawn to, and it felt like a very effective 8-part sort of serialization of that. I just enjoyed it kind of as a thing to watch. Like I'm not sort of massively in tank for it, but when I started watching it, I was fairly sure it was going to be terrible.
Yeah,
but it actually ended up kind of having sort of it still tells the story of a place, I think, as well. Like I've got a couple of friends who live in Venice Beach, and they say it's actually really, really good at describing the culture of Venice Beach.
Right.
So it does a few things well. I think that his sidekick is kind of a bit depressingly useless.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing. But anyway, yeah.
That's good. And also, very quickly, I watched Winter's Bone, which was a massive recommendation from you, and I really liked that. It's
good.
It's excellent. Of all sort of, it's very novelistic. I believe it is an adaptation of a novel. It has this very interesting structure to it. The acting is incredibly good. Also, it does something I really like, which is that a character gets hurt at one point, and then the whole of the rest of the movie, like she's dealing with the injuries from being hurt. Like it really matters that the character gets hurt, and you really feel terrible about it happening. And it has a big consequence. And I think violence, being the most overdone thing in all movies, to see a movie that puts that in a really interesting narrative context is great. So Winter's Bone is awesome. So good recommendation.
Yeah, loved Winter's Bone. Loved how it told the story of a certain place and time through sort of one crime, not a nuclear bomb going off in LA, not like a serial killer, but kind of one relatively subtle crime. I loved it.
Good. Right, we will now whip through the games that were released this week, or rather last week, in 2006, thanks to Eurogamer and producer Jimmy. We'll start with The Godfather on PS2, Xbox, and PC. I always get the Godfather games and the Mafia games confused, for understandable reasons.
Yeah, I think they're almost exactly the same.
Well, that's that. The Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion on Xbox 360 and PC.
Oh my goodness. I bought this on day of release.
Yep.
I absolutely loved it. Definitely my favourite of the Elder Scrolls.
This is really weird for me now because we're getting back into my renewed era of PC gaming because I got a new PC specifically to play this, built by Jeff in your old house.
Oh, I remember. You got him a bottle of whiskey to say thanks.
I did, and it was amazing. I really enjoyed getting back into PC gaming, and this was a great game to do it with. I remember the lighting in the first dungeon bit just being this really exciting thing that was kind of amazing at the time.
That's funny that you remember the lighting in the game, because I remember the lighting of the case of the PC he built.
Yes.
Really stupid.
Yes, we kind of had a slightly pimp my car style case. Final Fight Streetwise on the Xbox and PS2, proving that the Final Fight franchise can never die. Ice Age 2 The Meltdown on the GameCube and GBA. Worms Open Warfare on the PSP and DS. Do you play that?
Yeah, I have that on my Vita, actually. It's not very good.
Gauntlet 7 Sorrows on the Xbox, another hoary old franchise. Namco Museum 50th Anniversary on the Xbox. We need to have some kind of sound effect that we play whenever there's an arcade compilation.
Honk.
Pro Evolution Soccer Management on the PS2? Really? They had a management spin-off game? Interesting.
Apparently.
Stellar Deus, The Gate of Eternity on PS2. I'm not going to look that up, but I'm sure it's an RPG. Act of War High Treason on the PC. I'm sure that's an RTS.
Strong name.
Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth. I'm not going to say my standard thing about not remembering which Call of Cthulhu game is which. Samurai Warriors State of War. I feel that's a slightly redundant title because of the word warriors on the PSP.
State of Peace.
Key of Heaven on the PSP. Mega Man Powered Up on the PSP. Street Riders on the PSP. Street Racing Syndicate on the GBA. This isn't a random game name generator. It's an actual game.
It's 2006.
2006. And now we catapult ourselves unwillingly into the current, or rather last week's, top 10 UK Steam games. We really do need to get back on track. Number 10 was Battlefleet Gothic Armada. Lots of excitement around this game. I think could be an interesting one. 10% off. Factorio at number 9. You were saying that you want to play Factorio.
I do. Next time I get a second, I will buy and play Factorio.
Dark Souls 3 at number 8. Stardew Valley at number 7. It's toppled a little. It had such a good run at number one. I kind of want one of these indie games to just come and just camp out at number one forever, but not quite. Fallout 4 Season Pass number 6, Dark Souls 3 Deluxe Edition at number 5, Fallout 4 at number 4, Fallout 4 Automatron DLC at number 3. Don't know, don't care. Tom Clancy's The Division at number 2, and Grand Theft Auto 5 at number 1. That's more than enough of that, I think. There's an extra television and film lounge area that's empty, that's sitting underneath this in the show notes, but I think we've done enough from that.
Did we need to? Maybe not.
No, we didn't. Right, you've got a question that you want to talk about.
Yeah, it's a two-part question. Should you be allowed to make games anonymously? And if so, should people be allowed to try and find out who you are and make it public?
Okay, so firstly, what do you mean by allowed?
I mean, is it okay? Is there any ethical problem with making a sort of not massively offensive game and releasing it anonymously? I'm presuming that the answer to that would be no.
No, there's no problem with that.
Yeah, and if that's the case, is it okay for people to try and find out who you are and out you?
I think no. The problem is that people will,
Right.
if your game is popular. Also, journalists will use the adjective reclusive, which is journalist code for did not grant me an interview last press cycle. So you have to watch out for that one. If you don't like doing interviews, you are a reclusive creator. Yeah, should people be allowed to try and find out who you are and make it public? I think I would like to hope that there would be some very strong calls for people to not do that if you'd made it explicitly clear that you wanted to be anonymous. I think in most cases where people want to be anonymous, it's probably because of either the content of what they're making or their personal identity being something that they don't want to deal with any personal attention, which I think is a valid choice. The problem is that it's completely unworkable. Given the internet, if something achieves sufficient popularity, people would be able to find out who you are. So I feel like it's better to get ahead of the story and shut that down, shut the excitement of that down earlier. But by the same token, anonymous creation is good.
Yeah, I guess. I'm just trying to work out whether I think... Because obviously there's, I don't think it should be not allowed for you to make a game under a pseudonym, I suppose. Although there's sort of some aspect of publishing an artwork that I kind of feel should be attached to a person, but it may not be a particularly well thought through feeling of mine. For me, the really interesting thing is sort of how ethically bad is it to sort of publish. Do you become a public figure by releasing a piece of artwork? People are allowed to take pictures of the royals because they're public figures, and legally they do actually have a very different expectation of privacy to a person who doesn't. And I'm kind of wondering whether releasing a game on the internet or publishing a book actually should reduce your expectation of privacy.
Well, I'm always the pragmatist about this. I mean, it just will. So whether it should or not, I mean, if you look at Banksy is a situation where everyone knows who he is. It took a reasonable amount of time for someone to
do we know who he is now? I'd actually missed that.
Oh, it's been known for years and years and years that it's just this guy who lives in Bristol.
Oh, okay.
It's not very interesting. So that's one where, that was a really interesting case because there's this whole who's Banksy? And then a newspaper found out, and they're like, yeah, he's an artist, and he lives here. And everyone went, huh, and ignored that. So now people think that he's still anonymous. So that's, the problem there is that the answer is uninteresting. So I think anonymity is kind of a conscious, active part of what you're creating, rather than it is something that you can do personally to ensure that your identity isn't revealed. It's kind of part of your artistic statement. It's just, if it were possible to be anonymous, then that would be a different thing, but it just isn't.
You see, that's all fine, but my perspective is that I think it possibly is definitely okay for people to try and find out who you are. So I'm actually coming at it from a different point of view of the pragmatism aspect of this, because I think that I think you get some advantages to being anonymous, and some of them are inciting people's curiosity, and that kind of leads it to be or right if people want to try and find out who you are in a legal manner. I'm just kind of interested in sort of whether it's rude or not. If someone writes a book that a lot of people like, it is a lot to ask of people to not publish the name if they find out who it is.
Well, I think it would be nice if you were able to do it, because then you'd have a lot more freedom in terms of what you were able to publish, and also, for people for whom protecting their identity is vital to their safety, for various different reasons, then everything would be a lot better. So I think,
Would it be better if everyone was able to publish anonymously, or would it be worse?
It would be better for the creator.
As long as he was, doing something that was morally okay, right? Like,
well, no, it would still be better for them.
Right? Yeah, that's true.
It would still be better for them. I mean, and then you get into what is and isn't morally okay. Like, I would be really interested to see what happened. I would be interested to see a very popular game where the anonymity of the creator wasn't related to the content of the game. So it wasn't some kind of marketing stunt. It wasn't anything, to do with that. It was just because they didn't want anyone to talk to them. And then I would be interested to see what happened there. Because I do feel like a lot of people would respect that, or would try and respect it. And then at a certain level of popularity, it would become impossible. But maybe it would be, it would be possible for there to be you could have consistent mid-range successes and people wouldn't really know who you are. I mean, there are some indies that make certain types of games, and they're people who never go to events and they never really do personal interviews. So I guess that's a form of anonymity where it's sort of a practically maintained anonymity.
Yeah, fair enough. It's just an interesting thing that I was thinking about, and I feel we covered it now.
Good. That's the end of that, and I think probably very fittingly the end of this mammoth show. It's good to be back. We'll try and be a bit more regular with these things. It is a challenge, but we've received, by the same token, a lot of nice comments recently from various different people who enjoy listening to the show, and that's wonderful. If you like the show, please do tell other people to listen to it, and please follow us on Twitter and talk about it. I'm Mode7Games, and he's Ian Hardingham. I will see you at Norwich Gaming Festival, at Hype Spotting 5 in Glasgow, and at Rezzed very soon. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening, and goodbye.
That's it, children. Time for bed. Don't forget to pay us a visit at www.visitingthevillage.com.